Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
How's everybody doing? Welcome to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Nick Bowles, and there's plenty to talk about today. We'll talk about some of the latest transfer moves or possible transfer moves through the portal. Maybe look at some of the 2021 recruiting class. Georgia signed a big 5-star commit at quarterback. Maybe look at some of the possible selection committee changes that happened today or additions. Also want to take a deep dive into the ACC schedule that came out. And perhaps at the end we'll have a little fun talking about the college football playoff for next year and some of my ideas on it. But we'll go ahead and keep rolling with the transfers, as that's the big story as of now and as is with this time of the year. And we'll just continue rolling with Miami. Last podcast I talked about Miami, how they had a couple very good signings. They had Derek King from Houston. Roche is coming over as well. And they also got the kicker from Florida International, Borregales. Sorry if I mispronounced that. But their latest signee is actually a transfer, or was technically going to be a commit to Washington State. Their latest addition is wide receiver Keyshawn Smith. He was originally going to go to Washington State, but after Mike Leach pulled out, he was given the ability to get out of his letter of intent. Smith was rated the number 152 ranked wide receiver in the country, number 84 out of the state of California, and he is going to be part of a pretty good wide receiver recruiting class that Miami has gotten so far. They got two other wide receivers, one being a 4-star in Michael Redding, and the other is actually a 4-star as well, Dazalin Worsham. Michael Redding is the number 28 player at his position at wide receiver, and Worsham is number 57 ranked wide receiver in the nation. So they have quite an impressive class coming in at wide receiver that's probably going to work pretty well with Derek King. If Derek King is going to make teams pay attention to him with his legs, to be able to have a nice wide receiver group coming in, they could possibly do some pretty good things. And as I said before, and I'll repeat it again, their offense has just been atrocious the past year or so. To get Derek King, to get these three recruits at wide receiver, they added the kicker, who perhaps is not a head-turner, but he's pretty decent at his position and is a definite upgrade for them. And just a little fun fact, Jose Borregales actually hit two very big field goals against Miami last year to actually beat Miami, and taunted them pretty bad after he did it, and he'll now actually be transferring over to the U, so that's kind of an interesting twist. So Miami is making some good moves through the transfer portal, as well as getting the pickup of Keyshawn Smith. They also made some pretty impressive transfer portal moves last year. Unfortunately, I guess it didn't really pan out for them as it turned out. But I think Derek King is going to be a big boost for them, and I think he's going to do some pretty impressive things at Miami. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm looking forward to seeing how their offense does next year and how they overall do in the ACC, which we'll get into a little bit later. Just some other notes on the transfer portals and some other moves. Offensive lineman Coy Cronk is going from Indiana to Iowa. Cronk is actually a pretty impressive offensive lineman. He started 40 straight games for Indiana. He was an All-American as a true freshman, which is very impressive. He got hurt last year, though, after he had an ankle injury, which knocked him out for the remainder of the season. He will be looking to replace Tristan Wirfs on that front line for Iowa, and Tristan Wirfs is going to probably be a first-round pick in the NFL draft. So no small task to replace him. If you're going to replace him, Coy Cronk looks to be one of the better gets in the transfer portal this year. He's already a proven player. Again, like I said, with these transfer portal guys, a lot of the times you know what you're getting. You've already seen them play. There's tape. And since this guy's already been an All-American, he does have some big shoes to fill, obviously. But if someone's going to fill some big shoes in terms of having to replace a possible first-round draft pick, no better guy to do it than someone who's already been an All-American. Iowa gets a very good pick up there with Coy Cronk, who is eligible to play right away as a graduate transfer. The next team or players that we'll take a look at come out of the University of Texas. It looks like they could possibly lose 2 defensive tackles, DeAndre Christmas-Giles and Jared Wilbon. Both are part of the 2016 class for the University of Texas. Giles was a 4-star recruit at the time and was ranked the number 35 tackle in the country. And Wilbon was a 3-star signee. Giles ended up playing 20 games during his tenure with the Longhorns, and just one of those appearances came in the past season. He had a total of 6 tackles and a fumble recovery. Wilbon, however, did a little better. He appeared in 36 games total as a Longhorn, and in 2018 was the second-team academic All-Big 12 lineman. He had a total of 19 tackles and a fumble recovery. And since both played fewer than 4 games their senior year this past year, they were able to preserve a season of eligibility. And as I said just a second ago, they'll be able for immediate eligibility once they transfer to whichever team decides to pick them up. Also, keep in mind, Longhorns had a lot of injuries on the defensive side of the ball last year, so probably just losing depth here more than anything. Had they stuck around at Texas, I'm not sure these guys would have played a whole lot. Texas has also had a lot of other players enter the portal. Wide receiver Jordan Pouncey, JP Urquidez, offensive tackle Javon Shepard, linebacker Caleb Johnson, and defensive back Donovan Duvernay. And the only one that's officially announced he's actually leaving Texas through the portal would be Pouncey, who's going to go ahead and transfer to the University of Florida. The next player who announced that he's going to enter the transfer portal is wide receiver Terrell Alexander from Oklahoma State. Not exactly a big name. He spent his last 4 years at Oklahoma State, was a 3-star in the class of 2016, much like the 2 defensive linemen from Texas. He played a little bit of wide receiver and cornerback. He's gone back and forth. He's officially listed as a wide receiver. He hasn't exactly played a whole lot, so not the biggest name, but he'll also be going into the portal with fellow wide receiver Patrick Kaufman and Grayson Boomer. The next move comes by way of Virginia Tech. They've landed a running back transfer from Rutgers, Raheem Blackshear. He only played 4 games last year and then decided to sideline himself so he could preserve a year of eligibility. He was a redshirt sophomore, and he's going to go ahead and seek a waiver that might let him get 2 more years of playing time. However, if that appeal is denied, then he would just be left with 1 season in 2021 in which he could play. He's a 3-star signee from 2017. He ran for 238 yards as a true freshman, and the next season he had 586. Blackshear is pretty good at catching balls out of the backfield. He's a good receiving back, which Virginia Tech could use probably pretty well within their system. In 2018, he led Rutgers in receiving yards, receptions, and receiving touchdowns. So that's pretty impressive for a second-year back at Rutgers. And despite playing just 4 games this past season, he was second on the Rutgers team with 29 receptions. And the leader, Bo Melton, only had 30. So essentially he led the team in receptions, only playing 4 games. And he was second in receiving yards also behind Melton. So this guy's obviously pretty good, or at least put up some pretty decent production for the little amount of time that he played. So I look for Virginia Tech to use him pretty well. I think he's a weapon they'll use right away, and we'll probably get a lot of good, solid production out of him. And then one more quick transfer note before we head to the break. NC State linebacker Brock Miller is going to go to Boise State. He was a 3-star from the 2016 class, played in 31 games. Last season, he had 7 tackles for loss, which were best for 3rd on the team, 40 total tackles, which were best for 8th. He will also be a graduate transfer and will play right away. It will also be his final year of eligibility. So when we come back, I have 1 or 2 more transfer moves or notes, And we'll touch on those real quick, and then we'll also get into the ACC schedule a little bit, which I want to kind of break down, since I think the ACC will actually be one of the more exciting conferences to watch next year. So stay tuned, and I'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Last segment, we talked about some of the latest transfer notes through the portal. And I have the last one here I wanted to talk about. West Virginia running back Martell Pettaway is going to go ahead and transfer to Middle Tennessee State. During his time at West Virginia, Pettaway ran for over 1,100 yards and 11 touchdowns. 623 yards and 6 touchdowns came in 2018. And he's going to be a drastic improvement from what they have at the running back position at Middle Tennessee State. Their senior back, Terrell West, couldn't even top 300 yards last year on the ground. Although it's important to note that their quarterback, Asher O'Hara, ran for over 1,000 yards. And they were ranked 53rd nationally with 172 rushing yards per game. It appears he'll be quite the improvement from what they currently have. He will be transferring as a graduate, so he'll have immediate eligibility. And I'm sure Middle Tennessee State will get as much use out of him as they can. So now that we've kind of gone over the latest transfer portal news, and there are many other players that I didn't get to who perhaps have not made a decision, or people who maybe have thought about entering the transfer portal but then ended up coming back to their original team. But those are just some of the bigger notes in terms of what has happened over the last couple of days since our last podcast. And this kind of brought me to start thinking about not this year's recruiting class necessarily, but the 2021 recruiting class. There was some big news that Georgia landed what is considered by many to be the best quarterback in the nation for the 2021 class, and that is Brock Vandagriff. He was originally committed to go to Oklahoma, and from the outside looking in, I guess a lot of people would wonder why you wouldn't go to Oklahoma if you were the top-ranked quarterback in the nation in your class, considering the job that Lincoln Riley has done with former quarterbacks, a couple Heisman winners, Jalen Hurts going to the playoffs this year. And I just thought this was an interesting story because of the reasons he has kind of given in terms of why he ended up picking Georgia over Oklahoma. Because from the outside looking in, I think most people would say that it's a no-brainer to pick Oklahoma, especially Oklahoma over a school like Georgia, who has struggled offensively in more recent years under Kirby Smart. This just kind of goes to show that, again, we're dealing with kids, and there's just a million things that go into why they could possibly pick a school. And essentially, over the Thanksgiving and Christmas break, he kind of said he talked to his family, and he wanted to stick around closer to home. He said he prayed about it, and he talked to those who are closest to him, and he just decided that sticking close to home would be the best fit for him. Currently, he goes to the Prince Avenue Christian School, which is only 20 miles away from Athens, so that should kind of put in perspective how close he is to Georgia, and more importantly, the Georgia Bulldogs. You know, to me, it makes all the sense in the world. I know that when I was going to college, I went close to home, not necessarily because I wanted to, but looking back, it really helped me that I was close to home. You know, if you needed something, it was an hour drive. It wasn't that hard to perhaps get away from the dorms or the college life if you wanted to go home for the weekend, etc. In my opinion, I think he's made the right move for him. I also think the fact that Oklahoma has the quarterback Rattler coming up this next season, and depending on how he does, Rattler could really secure that quarterback position no matter who's coming up behind him. Rattler is essentially the Vandegrift of last year's class, and perhaps that had something to do with it. Keep in mind that Georgia is having Jamie Newman come in only for 1 year, essentially meaning that Vandegrift will be able to step in and possibly compete for that starting job. Maybe Kirby Smart will feel like he needs to get another year of seasoning under his belt or learning the playbook. It looks like that starting job will be his unless something out of the ordinary happens, which of course we all hope it doesn't. To sort of carry over, I thought we would take a quick look at some of the other big 2021 commits so far. There's not many, but I always find it interesting to look down the road as much as we can and see who has who. The number one commit that I'm actually looking forward to see how they do is going to be Jake Garcia, who's going to USC. Jake Garcia is a 5-star pro-style quarterback. He's a 14th ranked player in the nation. He's the number 3 ranked quarterback overall. And the only reason why I'm so excited or interested to see how he does is because obviously, as I mentioned earlier in some other podcasts, USC has just really had a hard time getting back on top of that national stage, considering all the sanctions that they had after the Pete Carroll era. And this guy seems to be what you could maybe call a fresh start or could possibly be a game changer depending how he turns out. For many of these programs, especially the big ones, sometimes it just takes a 5-star here and there at a weakness or at a certain position to sort of get you over that hump. And if there's any position in football, obviously having a 5-star at the quarterback position could just quite be that game changer that USC is looking for. They also have an impressive 2021 class right now. They're ranked 10th in the nation. The other interesting 5-star is going to be J.J. McCarthy. He's going to Michigan, and again, Michigan is hurting for a quarterback or some kind of quote-unquote franchise player to sort of get them back on the map as well. He's the 17th ranked overall player, number 4 at the quarterback position, and so I also look forward to see how he will do. The interesting surprise, in my opinion, so far from the 2021 class is Sam Hurd. And for those of you who don't know who the Hurd family is, the Hurd family was essentially the Mannings before the Mannings were Mannings. Brock, Damon, and Luke Hurd all played for the FBS, and Brock and Damon ended up actually becoming the first brothers to start on an NFL weekend, I believe. And their younger brother Luke ended up pursuing a coaching career after playing at North Carolina. Sam Hurd is the son of Damon Hurd. So just to put in perspective how big this family is into football and perhaps the amount of knowledge that Sam Hurd is bringing to Washington Huskies once he signs in 2021, I'm very interested to see how he does. I think he has an amazing ability to perhaps do some great things at Washington. I'm really interested to see exactly what he can achieve there. See if he can give the Pac-12 a run for their money, maybe put Washington on the map, who knows. But he's actually, of the 2021 class, I am most interested to see how he does out of everybody. He has already thrown for 10,000 career yards as a junior, and the Washington State record in terms of high school passing yards stands a little over 13,000 yards. So Sam Hurd looks like he is going to smash that record as long as he doesn't get hurt or anything. So this kid's coming in, already have achieved a lot. I believe the confidence is going to be there. I'm interested to see who else he can bring with him to Washington over the next year. I'm sure there will be a lot of wide receivers who will be looking to play with him or will be wanting to play with him. So this is one of those situations where Washington is having sort of a golden egg fall into their lap, and who knows what they'll be able to achieve over the next 4 years once he starts playing at Washington. So there's just a couple names you guys can look out for. I like to try and get ahead of the curve so I can look smart and obviously give you guys something to talk about right now when we're in the lull of the season. A lot of transfers and recruiting being talked about. So those are just some names, not only because I think they're good players, but I think where they're going is interesting when you're talking about USC and Michigan. And then to see someone with the background of Sam Hurd going to Washington, I look to see if he can possibly also do some great things there. So when we come back, I want to get into the ACC schedule. that came out recently. I kind of want to go through it. I think there's some really cool games that they're going to be playing both in conference and out of conference. So when we come back, we'll talk about that and get into it a little bit. So you guys stay tuned, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast. Last segment, we went over some of the 2021 recruits to look out for. Some names that I think are pretty interesting at the quarterback position. I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do. And I know I'm a few years ahead of schedule, but I still think it's interesting once you start diving into college football. Obviously, recruiting is a lot of it, and I find it interesting to see where kids are going to go. Maybe try and see where schools may be and how they'll be performing 2, 3, 4 years ahead of schedule. So right now I want to get into the ACC schedule. I think there's some pretty interesting games here. And I know the ACC kind of gets hated on as being the weakest of the Power 5, and rightfully so, minus Clemson, obviously. But I found, looking at the schedule, I think there are some pretty interesting games, some games that I'm really looking forward to seeing. And I'll go ahead and start off. Number one game I'm looking forward to seeing is Clemson at Notre Dame. Now, I know a lot of people hate on Notre Dame. They always think that they're overrated. And for the most part, I agree with that. But I must say the last couple years, I feel like Notre Dame has been overhated. And I think they've been sort of underestimated in terms of the athleticism they have on the field. And I think that they've played a much better brand of football the last couple of years and have lived up to their ranking more than disappointed. So November 7th, Clemson goes to Notre Dame. And I'm just interested to see this game because, as usual, Clemson's going to have essentially a cakewalk all the way to the ACC championship game. Now, the reason why I'm looking forward to it, though, is that Saturday, October 24th, they play Syracuse, which, you know, Syracuse sometimes can kind of come out and get you, but I don't see them challenging Clemson in any real shape, form, or fashion. Then they have a week off, and then they play Notre Dame. Just those 3 weeks combined will obviously be the real test of their schedule. They also play Florida State October 10th, which, you know, Florida State, who knows sometimes, although I don't really think they're going to be that good next year. I could be wrong. That 3 week stretch, I think the Syracuse game could be a little bit of a trap game. They've got a week off after that, and then they'll be looking to play Notre Dame, who essentially will be their biggest game of the year. Essentially, they're replacing playing Texas A&M the last couple of years early in the season with playing Notre Dame later in the season this year. So I look forward to that. I think that's going to be an interesting 3 weeks for Clemson. Maybe we get an upset there. Maybe we catch Clemson falling asleep. Who knows how they do, replacing all the players that they might lose. But those 3 weeks could be very interesting to watch in terms of Syracuse maybe being a trap game, having a week off. Who knows? They get a little rusty, a little complacent, something of this nature, and then who knows what Notre Dame is able to do at home. Remember, Notre Dame will be at home, and maybe we see a good game. Maybe we see some kind of upset. Who knows? I mean, Clemson's only lost one game the last 2 years, essentially, last 2.5 years. And so it just may feel like they're due for another loss. Who knows? I mean, if they haven't played any real competition up till then, maybe Notre Dame's able to shock the world. But I just think those 3 weeks will be fun to watch for Clemson. But then obviously after that, I mean, they have the Citadel Bulldogs, Wake Forest, and then South Carolina, as they always do with the last game of the year. So maybe the South Carolina Gamecocks, sometimes they have a bit of a tough team. They're able to sort of muddy the game up a little bit, slow it down somewhat. Who knows? Maybe they keep it close in some form or fashion and make it a good game. But those 3 weeks, October 24th, they play Syracuse, then a week off, October 31st, and then they play Notre Dame in Indiana, Saturday, November 7th. So I'm really looking forward to that Notre Dame game. I think perhaps Clemson could be a little overrated next year just because of all the pieces they've lost and the fact that Notre Dame, I think, has been a little underrated the last couple years. So I think that could be a good clash during that 3-week period. Maybe Notre Dame's able to get an upset in there. Then the next team that I'm looking forward to watching next year is the Miami Hurricanes. I've kind of always been stale on the Miami Hurricanes just because I feel like since back in the U days, they've always kind of been overhyped, more of a logo than a team. But I feel this year, the fact that they have been so good in the transfer portal, and the main reason is because they got De'Aaron King, I'm looking forward to seeing how they do. I want to see if they are able to come out, keep that above average defense or the defense that they've had the last few years, which has been decent, and put it together with some offense. I also like their schedule. I think they got a lot of good tests, but are winnable games. Their first test will be Temple, Saturday, September 5th. Now remember, they had Roche who transferred from Temple over to Miami, so that'll be kind of a good rivalry game, a bit of a pride game, if you will, for both teams. Then they have a couple weeks here. They have the Wagner Seahawks, the UAB Blazers. Then they play at Michigan State, which I think will probably be their hardest or second hardest game of the year. Maybe in their top 3. Michigan State, in the past has been a very sort of defensive-minded team, very physical team. And so I'm very interested to see the contrast of what I think will be a bit of a quote-unquote high-flying sort of spread-them-out offense of Miami against Michigan State. I think it's going to be an interesting style matchup, and that's on Saturday, September 26th. That's their 4th game of the year. They go to East Lansing, Michigan, and I still think Michigan State probably comes away with the win, but depending on how that offense is clicking by that time, having 3 games under their belt, who knows? We could see a totally different Miami team. Then they play the Pittsburgh Panthers. Then they play Wake Forest. Then they have a week off October 17th. And then they play the North Carolina Tar Heels, which Miami and North Carolina, minus being in the ACC, are actually 2 of the teams I'm looking forward to the most to see how they play next year. I think that North Carolina, in all honesty, considering they played Clemson to a 2-point loss last year, and Mac Brown has another year under his belt, he's got a top 20 recruiting class this year. Who knows what North Carolina is able to do against Clemson? Do I think Clemson wins? Yes, obviously. I think they have the edge. They have the talent. I know that Dabo Swinney obviously has more rings and he has more championships and more accolades, but Mac Brown is no scrub when it comes to coaching. So I really am looking forward to North Carolina as well as the most interesting team, maybe in all of football next year, that I'm really looking forward to seeing, minus the big names, obviously. I think North Carolina could be one of those shockers that comes up, and who knows, maybe they only lose a couple games if they're able to put a season together under Mac Brown. But North Carolina and Miami, depending on how those 2 teams have played up till then, really could be a make-or-break game for either one of them. So if they're able to get a win against North Carolina, that would be a huge feather in their cap, as well as maybe having a chance to beat Michigan State. Then they play Virginia. That back-to-back of North Carolina and Virginia will probably be the make or break for Miami in terms of their season being really good or not so good. And then after Virginia, they play Florida State. Then they play the Virginia Tech Hokies, which again is no easy win. Then they play Georgia Tech, and they round out their year playing Duke. And Duke sometimes is hit or miss depending on how they're doing. But I think that Miami is able to end the season on a good note with 4 or 5 wins depending on how they're doing that year and if things are clicking offensively, which I'm hoping that they will be. But to recap Miami, if they can beat Michigan State, the 3rd game of the year, then they get what should be 2 wins. Then they get a week off, and then they play North Carolina and Virginia. And essentially within that time frame, we will know if they're good or not. And then the last 4 games of the year, I expect them to win, or I think they have a slight edge if they are doing what I think they are capable of doing on offense. And they could end up having a surprisingly good year. So when we come back, I'll get into some of the other teams in the ACC I'm looking forward to, break down their season as well, and we'll see how I think they're going to do. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast. Last segment, we covered some of the ACC teams on breaking down the entire schedule, and we went over Miami and Clemson. This segment, I want to get into North Carolina, which I have stated a few times is probably the number 1 team I'm interested to see how they do. I'm interested to see how they play and where they end up. And what I mean by this is not that I think they'll contend for a national championship or anything, but I think Mac Brown has them going in the right direction. I think their trajectory is on a good path. I think that the sky is sort of the limit in terms of North Carolina football. Again, they will always have to deal with Clemson, and so therefore I think they kind of have a ceiling on top of them. But Mac Brown has coached them to a pretty good year last year. They lost to Clemson by 2. He's recruiting very well out of North Carolina. So I'm just excited to see if they can sort of turn that corner this year and maybe be a 2 or 3 loss team and be very respected across the nation. So let's go ahead and take a look at their season this year. They start off playing the UCF Knights, and the Knights are no cakewalk, even though they might not be in the Power 5. But the UCF Knights typically have a pretty decent program the last, 5 years or so. They are, like I said, no easy win, but I think that North Carolina can win this game. I think the spread, or how people will see it in terms of being objective, I think it'll be a very close game, might even be a pick'em, 3 points to North Carolina, something like that. Then after that, they go to Auburn. They're going to play Auburn in Atlanta, Georgia. I think this will be sort of the litmus test. Now, they don't need to win this game per se, but they can't get blown out. And Auburn obviously had a pretty good year last year. They sort of had a few losses there towards the end of the year that kind of hurt them, but considering they're playing in the SEC, I thought they had a very good year. So if they can get past these first 2 games, I think it will sort of be the litmus test of how good they can be for the rest of the year. Then they have James Madison, obviously a win. Georgia Tech should be a win. Then they have Virginia and Virginia Tech back-to-back. And I think they should be able to win these games. Last year, looking at North Carolina's schedule, they beat South Carolina in their opener. They barely beat Miami by 3 points. Then they lost to Wake Forest. That was when Jamie Newman was clicking. He obviously got hurt later in the year, but Jamie Newman continued to play. Wake Forest would have been a respectable loss. Now, they ended up kind of struggling once he got hurt, so, it maybe didn't look too well at the end of the year. But for the time, losing to Wake Forest at that time is nothing to be ashamed of. Then they lost to Appalachian State, another top-ranked team. They ended up being top 20 in the nation at the end of the year. They lost to them by 3 points. Then they lost to Clemson by 1 point. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. They lost to Clemson by 1 point. I've been saying they lost by 2 this whole time, but even better then. That makes my argument even better. So they lost to Clemson by 1 point, which, for North Carolina to lose to Clemson by 1 is almost a win in college football. Their ranking probably went up because they lost by 1. Then they beat Georgia Tech. They have a 6 overtime game in which they lost to Virginia Tech by 2 points. Again, that's a respectable loss. Then they beat Duke. Then they lost to Virginia by a touchdown. Virginia ended up having a good year. So that is not the worst loss either. They lost to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh ended up being okay. Then they go on a run here. They beat Mercer, they beat North Carolina State, and they beat Temple to finish out the year 7-6. And essentially what I'm looking for North Carolina to do this year is to shave off a couple of those losses and win a couple of those close games. They don't play Appalachian State this year. They will still have to get over Virginia and Virginia Tech. But again, they lost to Virginia by a touchdown and lost to Virginia Tech by 2 points. So if North Carolina can take this jump and improvement, which I think they will, I think they end up winning those 2 games, or at least winning one of those games to shave off a loss. Then they play Duke, should be a win. And then the game that I mentioned last segment with Miami on October 24th, essentially, if North Carolina does what I think they will do, and that is I think they will beat UCF to start off. They might lose to Auburn, but then I am hoping that they can probably go ahead and run the table for the next 5 games until they play Miami, and I think that will be a make or break for both of those teams. So they play Miami. They're playing them in Miami, though. They're playing them in Florida, so they will be on the road, but I don't think that's too much of a big deal. I'm not sure if you'd call Miami a massive home field advantage at this point. Then they have a week off, which I think is important for them because the next 4 games, they play UConn, which should be a win. Pittsburgh and Boston College back-to-back will not be easy wins, but again, I think North Carolina will at least win one of those games and maybe lose one. And then they play NC State to end the season. I'm looking North Carolina to go 9-3, maybe 10-2 if they can get a ball to bounce their way in one of these close games. They could end up going 8-4, which would not be the worst record in the world. That would still be a 1-win improvement, and depending on if they have a couple close, tight losses here or there, could be respectable or understandable. They don't play Clemson this year, so you would have to think that's at least one more win that they get. So if North Carolina can go 9-3, which I think is very possible, I would say North Carolina could end up probably being the most improved team of the year, especially if some of those 3 losses come against a ranked team or are a close loss. And I think that North Carolina could be on the verge of starting something very nice there down in Chapel Hill, especially with Mac Brown at the helm, who's been there and done that. So that is North Carolina. When we come back, I want to break down Virginia and Virginia Tech, and I'll probably leave it there. I might touch on Boston College, but I think those will essentially be the main teams I want to look at from the ACC. So go ahead and stay tuned, and we'll be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. We're continuing our breakdown of the ACC schedule, how I see it kind of playing out. We've already covered Clemson, Miami, and North Carolina, and I'm very high on North Carolina next year. I think they could probably shave off a loss or two, maybe beat Virginia or Virginia Tech, and possibly do some exciting things in terms of that being a new program to watch out for next year and for the years to come, with Mac Brown doing the job that he's doing right now. Now, I know he's only done it for 1 year, so who knows? They could take a step back. They could go the other way. That's definitely possible, but I see their trajectory going in the right direction, so I expect them to win another game or two next year and perhaps maybe start to make the ACC very interesting, along with them in Miami, depending on what happens. The next couple teams I want to get into are Virginia and Virginia Tech. And I'll go ahead and start with Virginia since they had the slightly better year last year, and I also think they had the more interesting schedule, mainly because they start off the year against Georgia. Then they play the VMI Cadets, which should be an obvious win. UConn, which should be an obvious win. And then they go back-to-back. They play Clemson and North Carolina, and then they have a week off. So they have a very tough schedule to begin the year. Their first 5 games, minus obviously the VMI Cadets and the UConn Huskies, 3 out of those 5 games are going to be very tough games. Even with North Carolina being the least of the big 3, North Carolina, I think, will not be a cakewalk by any means. Even if they don't do as well as I think they will, they still will not be an easy win. Now, I want to mention one thing. I find big non-conference matchups early in the year to be very interesting, both in how they play, not just for that game and in that moment, but how it looks going on throughout the season. A good example is Texas losing to LSU last year. Texas almost got a win against LSU. They lost by a touchdown. And while I think that had they played LSU later in the year, I think LSU would have crushed them by 3 or 4 touchdowns at least. They were able to play them in the beginning of the year, and they lost by a touchdown. And so at the end of the year, if you're Texas, you're very happy with that loss. You got to say that overall that loss looked pretty good, especially compared to how everyone else played LSU. For Virginia, I think they are looking to merely hang on in this first game. If they can keep it within single digits, if Georgia can go on to have a good year, which I think we expect them to, although they could perhaps lose another game or two, just being in the SEC and playing some tough matchups, it could look very good for them later on as the year goes on. And if they beat them in the beginning of the year, then it looks good no matter what. I think that even if Georgia goes on to not have the best year, Virginia will jump in the rankings so high at the beginning of the year that essentially is a win-win for them as long as they don't get blown out. That if they win that game, it looks good, it boosts their rankings, and if they can hang on and not have a horrible loss and Georgia can go on to have a good year like they should, then it will continue to look better for them as the year goes on as well. So I think Virginia sort of is in a win-win in that first game. Again, they can't get blown out. That's the main thing. If they get blown out, then it won't really matter. But they play Georgia. They should have a couple wins the next 2 weeks. Then they play Clemson again. Same thing early in the year. If they can just merely not get blown out, keep it within 10 points, maybe 2 touchdowns, depending on how it sort of shakes down at the end of the game. But if they can hang on again, or I wouldn't even put it past them to not. And who knows, maybe they can pull an upset. Never say never in football, especially college football. That's why we play the game on the field and not on paper. But, as long as they can keep it within 10 points, that will look good on their record. That will not be necessarily held against them as the year goes on. Now, if they lose by 3 or 4 touchdowns, well, then it's kind of hard to stick up for them or to try and argue that it was a good loss. But essentially, those first 2 games, they're playing a couple top 5 teams, essentially. They kind of are in a win-win. They kind of have nothing to lose, and I think that's how they should also play. They should play as if they have nothing to lose. And then they have North Carolina, and again, North Carolina I think will do good next year, so depending on how they play that game and what happens, That will also be kind of a make or break game for those two teams. North Carolina really needs to beat Virginia and Virginia Tech next year, or at least win one of those games and not lose the other very bad. So I think that will be one of those jostling for position in the ACC kind of game. Then they have a week off, Saturday, October 10th. Then they play Georgia Tech, should be a win. Old Dominion should be a win. And then they play Miami October 31st. And even though I think Miami will be pretty good next year or decent for their standards, I think they beat Miami. Then they play Louisville, should be a win. Duke should be a win. Then they end the year with Pittsburgh and Virginia Tech. I'm kind of looking at their schedule, and if they can go those first 5 games and go 3-2, have a big win against one of those teams, maybe beat North Carolina, they lose to Clemson and Georgia, hopefully keep it close. You look at them being possibly 8-2, 7-3 as they go in to play Pittsburgh and Virginia Tech. And if they can win one of those games and lose one, or perhaps win them both, Virginia Tech also is shaping up to have a possibly very good year next year, even if they lose a couple games, because they will beat the top-ranked teams. And it's always the risk-reward playing really highly ranked teams is that, as long as you don't get blown out, it won't necessarily be held against you, but you also take yourself out of the running for the championship by losing a game sometimes. So it's kind of the risk-reward. But considering that Virginia is probably not going to win a national championship or get in the playoff anyways, I think it's worth the risk for them to play these top-ranked teams. And they should play as if they have nothing to lose, because they truly don't. So I think if they can be 8-2 going in to play Pittsburgh and Virginia Tech, that will be a very nice setup for them. And I think they can probably beat Pittsburgh. So you're looking at them possibly going 9-3 next year, depending on how that Virginia Tech game plays out, maybe being 10-2. So Virginia has a high upside next year is probably the best way to put it. And I'm sort of interested to see how they do as well. They seem to just kind of disappoint. They seem to always lose that game or two that you feel they shouldn't. But next year, if they can have the games that they lose be against Clemson and Georgia and, maybe Virginia Tech, then I think that's pretty respectable. And I think they end up with a pretty good ranking, probably even better than what they did last year. I think they ended up around the top 25, number 24, something like that. So you could look at them maybe being top 20 as we head into bowl season, depending on how it shakes out. And then from there, from Virginia, we will go to Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech last year was 8-5. Not a bad year for Virginia Tech in all honesty. They seem to always kind of be hovering around that 7-8, maybe sometimes 9-win season, but 7 or 8 wins is typically about right for them. Next year, Virginia Tech has a very favorable schedule. Again, the ACC is looking like an interesting conference next year. I'm really interested to see how it plays out. They play the Liberty Flames, first game of the year, that should be a win. And second game of the year, they play Penn State. And it's just like Virginia playing Georgia and Clemson early on. It's sort of a win-win. I mean, as long as they don't get blown out by Penn State, and they possibly could win, they're playing Penn State at home, they could be looking at a pretty good year next year in terms of their schedule and the amount of wins they can have. But let's say they lose to Penn State. They then play Middle Tennessee, should be a win. North Alabama, a win. Georgia Tech, a win. Then they play North Carolina October 10th. And those 3 games between North Carolina, Virginia, and Virginia Tech will be very fun to watch. I think that will sort of be who jockeys for position in terms of the number 2 or 3 team in the ACC. Maybe Miami shocks some people, but I essentially look for North Carolina, Virginia, Virginia Tech to sort of fight for that 2nd or 3rd seed in the ACC. Maybe Miami sneaks in there, but it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So again, they play Penn State second week of the season. And sort of how I mentioned with Virginia, I think it's a win-win for them. Again, no one's expecting anything out of the ACC, so they should play as if they have nothing to lose. And while I'm a big fan of Penn State next year, actually, but it's just sort of not a hot pick since they did so well last year, and I think they will do good this year as well. The Penn State game, they could end up shocking some people and winning that game. I don't think they win, but if they can keep it close, and Penn State goes on to have the year we all think they will, then it won't necessarily be held against them. Then they have a good chance to win their next 4 games before they have a week off. depending on how North Carolina's playing. Then they play Boston College, Louisville, and Pittsburgh, and they should win at least 2, if not all of those games. Pittsburgh and Boston College can sometimes be tough games. Pittsburgh is a pretty decent team. Last year they had a good year. Then they play Miami, and I think they should beat Miami. And then they play Duke, and then, of course, they end the year at Virginia. And that last game between Virginia and Virginia Tech, depending on how those two teams are doing, could be a sort of, being in the top 15, top 20 versus maybe falling out of the top 25, depending on how things shake out through the season. So in terms of Virginia, I like that Virginia's playing really good teams and that they could do good. And then with Virginia Tech, I like that they have a semi-easier schedule. I think it kind of works in both of their favors. And I think at the end, we will kind of see who is who when they play each other. So that's kind of my overall review of the ACC. Next segment, I will lightly touch on Pittsburgh because I think they're worthy of a review. They had a pretty good year last year. And then after that, I want to talk about the selection committee, sort of my ideas on it and some of the recent news that came out on it. So stay tuned. I'll be right back.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast. We are currently doing our review of some of the more notable teams in the ACC. Last segment we did Virginia and Virginia Tech. This segment I'm going to lightly touch on Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh actually had an okay year last year. Not many people may have realized that. They ended up going 8-5 after their bowl game. Pittsburgh ended up doing okay. They beat North Carolina. They lost to Miami and to Boston College, which are not good losses. But other than that, they kind of won all the games they should. They had sort of an ugly game against Penn State where they lost by a touchdown, which is respectable. But this year, I'm looking at their schedule, and they have the ability to get off to a good start and perhaps get some things rolling. Their first 5 games are Miami, Ohio. They should win. Marshall, they should win. Richmond, the Duke Blue Devils, and then Miami. Who knows, maybe Miami wins that game if they do as good as I think they possibly could do. But I think they start off going 5-0, and then they have a week off. And then they play Notre Dame. Depending on how they do against Notre Dame, depending on where Notre Dame is at during that time of the year, I think Notre Dame will be ranked, obviously. Notre Dame also has to play Clemson this year. This could be a good game for Pittsburgh, sort of a more notable team that is ranked, but a notable team that they can beat. And so they go and they play Notre Dame at home, which is obviously an advantage. And they could possibly win that game. I think Notre Dame wins. I think they just have the better athletes and the overall better team. But they could possibly beat Notre Dame. But you're looking at them essentially starting off going 5-1, let's say. Then they play Georgia Tech and Florida State next. Those should be 2 wins, I would think. So essentially they're looking at going 7-1. Maybe 6-2 to start the year. But then the last 4 games are not easy per se. They do finish the year against Syracuse, which Syracuse started hot last year, but then they ended up kind of fizzling out. They end the year with Syracuse. I think they should win that game. After the Florida State game, in which they could be 6-2, maybe 7-1, who knows? They play Virginia Tech, North Carolina, and Virginia. And they play Virginia Tech at home, but then they go on the road back-to-back to North Carolina and Virginia. But all of these games, except for maybe the Notre Dame game, are winnable games for Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's been very good, or at least decent the last 2 years. Very good might be a bit of a stretch. They've been decent the last 2 years, so it's not as if it's impossible. And considering the year they had last year, I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't end up having a pretty good year depending on how things shake out. I think they probably lose to Virginia Tech and Virginia. And if North Carolina is playing the way I think they will, North Carolina ends up turning that loss against Pittsburgh into a win next year. North Carolina lost to Pittsburgh by a touchdown in overtime last year. And so you could look at them perhaps getting off to a hot start, but then maybe running into 3 games there at the end of the year. Maybe 4, you never know, Syracuse, maybe they're actually able to put the whole season together. They get off to a good start, and then they probably run into some roadblocks there at the end of the year. The thing about college football, some of these teams, they get rolling, you start playing with a little bit of confidence, and who knows what they're able to do. So Pittsburgh is another interesting team out of the ACC, and I'll say it just one more time, I'm really excited for the ACC next year, and not a lot of people say that. I don't think a lot of people are paying attention to the ACC, and I don't really blame them, but I think the ACC is going to be a fun conference to watch next year. Not a lot of big names, but I think there will be good parity, and it will make for an interesting watch. That's kind of my recap on the ACC, and I now want to quickly transition while I have a little bit of time to the College Football Selection Committee, which has obviously been under a lot of scrutiny since they've come onto the scene, and respectfully so, or rightfully so, as you're not going to make everyone happy. So I don't think it's necessarily that they do a bad job. I actually think they've essentially gotten the teams right since they've had to do this, so it's nothing like that. I just had some thoughts on it, though. I kind of noticed they constantly bring people in and out, and one of the main problems that I have is that they bring in people who are perhaps former players or athletic directors, or sometimes are not even related to football at all, such as when they did Condoleezza Rice. But I thought I would have an interesting idea in terms of how they should make the committee or select the committee, because the one thing I really am sort of always worried about is bias, as we all are, I believe. And the athletic director part really sort of makes me nervous. Not so much players or the press or anyone else who might be sort of associated with football, although they are obviously guilty of having some bias at times too. But, you know, there's just so much money in football, and there's so much influence in terms of deals and marketing and TV and things of this nature that the athletic directors, while I'm sure they are outstanding people and upstanding people when it comes to being honest and trying to do this based on merit, it just sort of in the back of my mind doesn't sit well when there are people who are responsible for millions upon millions of dollars and the future of schools and perhaps other schools that are in their conference, etc. It just sometimes makes me a little worried, like in the back of my head, that something is going on. And rightfully so, we all have the right to be a little suspicious when it comes to that much money being involved. But I thought maybe an interesting way to get around this was if you had a pool of people, essentially a big pool, writers, players. You can still maybe have athletic directors in there to some degree, but people who are very knowledgeable of the game, perhaps maybe even old NFL people who are not big college names. And essentially as the year sort of gets further and further into the season, and then once we begin having this talk of the college football playoff like we do, perhaps once we have decided what the eligible teams will be or what the teams will more than likely be, we select people from this pool of people that are not associated or affiliated with the schools that are probably going to be involved in the playoff at the end. So in other words, if you have Oregon, Ohio State, Alabama, and Clemson, we would essentially be looking to pick people who we think are as removed from those programs as possible. I think this adds a layer of transparency to it. I think this adds a layer of protection in terms of bias or people perhaps being influenced by emotions or things of this nature. And again, I'm sure that the people, when they do it, they are honestly doing the best job they can. And perhaps this is more for us, the fans, and for the ones who are outside looking in, that we want to know that there's no kind of quote-unquote corruption or subversion or things of this nature. But I thought it'd just be an interesting idea to have a massive pool of people that you could pick from. And as we get closer to the end of the year, we pick certain people who are as removed but still have the merit to do the job as possible. And so I just thought that would be sort of an interesting way to do it, would be another layer of protection to make sure that we're getting the right teams and people are making the right decisions for the right reasons. So I'm just going to end on that. I know a lot of people like to talk about the college football playoff. Obviously, it's always fun to talk about at the end of the year. But I just read a story recently, where they kind of are picking and pulling people constantly, adding and removing people. And, I just think we'd like to see either some consistency, or we want to know what the plan is to expect going forward. And I think if people did that, it would make us feel a little more assured that we know what you are going to do and how you're going to select it and who is going to select it and why those people were chosen to select it. It was just sort of a little idea I had that I thought might have been fun to talk about. But that's my time for this episode. I appreciate you guys listening to me as always. Thank you for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please remember to subscribe and write a review. That always helps us. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And again, I appreciate you guys listening to me and giving me some of your time. I greatly appreciate that. So I'll talk to you guys in a few days, and you guys have a good rest of the week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.